Welcome to Sound Bites, hosted by registered dietitian nutritionist Melissa Joy Dobbins. Let's delve into the science, the psychology, and the strategies behind good food and nutrition.
Welcome to the Sound Bites podcast. Today's episode is about the intersection and sometimes the juxtaposition of food and nutrition science and journalism. My guest today is Tamar Haspel. She's a James Beard award-winning Washington Post columnist. She writes about food and science, covering food supply issues, biotech, pesticides, food additives, organics, food policy, and other similar subjects. And she's contributed to Discover, National Geographic, Fortune, and Vox, among other outlets. And when she's tired of the heavy lifting of journalism, she helps her husband on their oyster farm, Barnstable Oyster, where they grow about 300,000 oysters a year in the beautiful waters off Cape Cod. Welcome to the show, Tamar.
Thanks for having me, Melissa.
Really looking forward to talking with you. I have to say, from a registered dietitian nutritionist perspective, you get right what so many other journalists and writers get disappointingly wrong, if you will. To me, so often it seems like you're the voice of reason in a sea of misinformation and sometimes disinformation. So I would really like to talk with you a little bit about your background and the work that you do, and maybe talk about some of the articles that you've written recently that have really caught my eye.
Sure.
My first question for you is, how does one become an oyster farmer?
That's funny. People ask that all the time. And my husband and I moved to Cape Cod from Manhattan, basically by accident, about 11 or 12 years ago. And we started looking around to see, okay, well, what can you do in Cape Cod that you can't do in Manhattan? And the answer is all kinds of things. And my husband had been a floor trader in New York, traded commodities. And the floor basically went away. So he was looking for something to do. And we knew people who were in the oyster business. It looked interesting enough. He spent a year interning with a local guy, and then we were in the right place at the right time to get a lease. And we started doing it. And it has been interesting. It has been sometimes heartbreaking. It has informed my work writing about agriculture. And it has kept me outside and physically fit, which is a good thing. But it's something we probably can't do forever. It is, as we get older, the physical labor becomes sort of prohibitive.
How long have you been doing it now?
About 10 years.
You said heartbreaking. What's heartbreaking about it?
Sometimes we've killed a lot of oysters. Every oyster farmer will tell you kill a lot of oysters. And we are at the whims of the weather and disease and, the genetics of the oysters that we're raising. And all farming has heartbreak in it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you kind of have a up close and personal experience from that perspective. But you also, I understand, raise your own chickens, catch your own fish, grow your own tomatoes, and hunt your own venison.
We do. And I like to stay connected to the idea that food has to come from somewhere. And we want to source the things we eat as responsibly as we can. And for us, that's what it comes down to, growing a lot of our own food. I think that there are lots of good things to say about a large, efficient food supply, but there are also a lot of bad things. So we think a lot about that and eat accordingly.
Well, and that's one of the many things that I really admire about you is that I feel like you look at the whole picture, or as big of a picture as you can. And you understand that there are pros and cons and there are trade-offs. And you try to sort of appreciate all of that.
I try. And, people who agree with me, as you mostly do, think that I am, sensible and smart and the voice of reason. But people who disagree with me think that I'm not. So it's been frustrating, difficult, but also satisfying to write about all of these issues and to try and shift the conversation to areas that I think can be constructive and productive. But lots of areas really can't be that. And that's the frustrating part.
Right. And again, at the end of the day, even those people who disagree with you or, or maybe somewhat unprofessional or attacking, maybe is the word.
I wouldn't say that. I think that there are lots of people who disagree with me in good faith, who are well informed. And, the idea that people who disagree with you are bad guys is what sort of underlies most of the partisanship that goes on in the world. I'm disagreed with by lots of people who are well-intentioned and smart and well-informed, but see the world differently than I do. Of course, and I'm also the subject of attacks, and that comes with the territory. But one of the things I try and do is spend a lot of time listening to people who disagree with me, because that's how I learn.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that I feel so strongly about when I follow your work, is that whether someone agrees or disagrees, and like certainly there are some that aren't as nice about it, that you do listen so much, and that you are very passionate about that productive conversation and the solutions.
I try real hard to do it. Like everybody, I have days when I don't do it so well.
Nobody's perfect, right? And I find it challenging to speak up and put myself out there sometimes. It is a bit of a dance sometimes. So people like you who do have a really strong voice and just so smart and sharp and thorough, it gives me courage then to speak up too.
I appreciate that. And I'll just say again that you'll get a lot of pushback on that from someone.
Oh, I know. I've seen it. But let me back up a little bit, and then I want to come back to a quote of yours from a movie that I found so compelling that kind of brings back to what we were just talking about. But I wanted to know how you first became interested in writing about food and nutrition. I know that you've said in your writing that you used to be overweight. And I'm just curious about when food and nutrition sort of came on your radar, as far as, do you have a first nutrition thought memory, or when did you decide to start writing about it?
It's a terrible story. It's not interesting. It's not enlightening. It just so happens that my mother was, as she has their entire married life, was cooking for my father, who had serious heart problems, despite the fact that, he exercised, he kept his weight down, but he has these Eastern European genes that are just really bad news when it comes to cardiovascular systems. And this was in the 80s. This was when, the data was coming out of China that we were all familiar with, that said a diet that's very, very low in fat, Ornish level low, 10% or fewer of your calories coming from fat, could actually reduce the clogging of your arteries. And so that was the thing that people were experimenting with, these very low-fat diets. And, my mother was trying to do that, but she was dismayed by the quality of a lot of the food that had very little fat in it. And she thought, you can cook well even with that little fat. And so she started a newsletter. She and I started a newsletter called Dreaded Broccoli, Enjoying the Food You Should Eat. And it was just a very personal and very sort of chatty newsletter. And eventually it caught the attention of an editor at Scribner, and she signed us to write the book in the late 90s, I guess. And then that was the beginning of my career writing about food.
Well, I find that very interesting, especially as a dietitian. Oftentimes having a family member with nutrition-related disease issues, chronic disease issues, it is compelling. Where did you study journalism?
I never studied journalism.
Oh, that's why I couldn't find it in my research. What did you study?
Oh, come on. This was a million years ago. You want to know where I went to college?
Yeah.
What I studied?
Yeah.
It's hardly relevant.
Are you sure?
Yeah, I'm totally sure.
Okay. So this is like a second career for you?
Yeah, I guess so. I worked in, my first job out of college, I worked for IBM. I sold line of business application systems to small manufacturers and distributors, wholesale distributors. I know more about inventory control than you'd ever like to know.
Oh, fascinating. Okay. Well, I was just curious. So as we were talking about these productive conversations, cultivating these conversations, you were in the movie Food Evolution, and you said something that is just imprinted in my mind ever since. And I know you know the question that you said.
I do.
Would you like to share it with us?
So I go around and I give this talk about mind changing, because we all go out in the world with certain ideas, and we all sort of go out convinced that we're correct. And if only we can present our powerful arguments to other people, they will see that we are indeed correct. We all go out in the world hoping to change other people's minds. But I think the measure of open-mindedness is how often you change your mind. And I'm really sort of attuned to that. And I sort of go out in the world all the time trying to figure out what I'm wrong about, trying to find opportunities to change my mind. And when I talk to groups who are very invested in an idea, and in agriculture, there are all kinds of those. The organic people think that their method is best. The commodity farmers think their method is best. The pork guys think their method is best. And everybody who is invested in an idea has this sense that if only we can get the facts out there, they'll see it our way. And of course, that never works. And I ask people, when was the last time you changed your mind? And, I've stood in front of groups of hundreds of people, thousands of people sometimes, and asked them to tell me about a time they changed their mind in the last year. And there will be, a handful of people who have. It's often difficult for people to take a survey of their opinions and figure out which ones they've actually changed recently. And I think if we all start focusing on how we can change our minds rather than on how we can change other people's minds, discourse might be improved.
Yes, that question. When was the last time you changed your mind? So I use that quote, and I always attribute it to you.
Thank you.
In my media and communications trainings, especially those that focus on like difficult conversations, because I think it's a great place to start off on the right foot of approaching these conversations with an open mind. I mean, I think gone are the days, hopefully, for experienced communicators. And I work with dietitians, diabetes educators, other health professionals, just trying to get them to understand, yeah, the science and the facts are important, but this is not going to change hearts and minds. Having more of a dialogue and listening and finding that common ground and being open, I think just having that approach to begin with, if you don't start there, you're kind of doomed. So thank you for that compelling question. And like I said, I like to use that to kind of get people in the right frame of mind.
I'm glad it's useful.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you talk about people having their opinions. And we like to say in the nutrition world, you can have your opinions, but you can't have your own science.
Melissa, I have to tell you, I hate that. You can have your own opinions, but you can't have your own science. Because the thing is, since the beginning of time, every person who has ever asserted an opinion believes that the science backs them up.
Right.
And when they say, when they disagree with you, they believe you are listening to the wrong science, that you have been hoodwinked by agendas or you have misunderstood research or whatever it is. I mean, you look at the things that fly in the face of what mainstream science believes, like something as simple as evolution. And people who believe in New Earth creationism believe that the evidence supports their point of view. And when you say something like, you can have your opinion, but you can't have your own science, you're saying the equivalent of, you're a douchebag because I'm listening to science and you're just going with your gut. And that's nonsense because everybody thinks that science supports their point of view.
Right. Well, that's what I was going to say, is that our opinions and our beliefs are so strong. And that's, if you want to call it confirmation bias or the fast thinking versus slow thinking, there's reasons we're kind of hardwired to think this way. And I talk about this a lot on the podcast. And that brings me to one of the most recent articles that you wrote that when I read it, I was actually in DC at the time when it was published. It was late February and, had the actual paper in front of me instead of reading it online. And I was like, okay, I've been wanting Tamar on the show forever. I just have to finally, get the guts up to ask her. But the article was titled, "When It Comes to Nutrition, We're All Too Eager to Ignore the Evidence. And Here's Why." And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I feel like it's sort of about the N of one and the power of our own perceptions. I'd love to talk with you a little bit about that and share with our listeners what the article shares about the personal experience overriding research findings and what you call the Walther Effect. So can we talk about that?
Poor old Walther, he's gotten a lot of for this. But here's the thing if you read a study that says, ginkgo biloba improves memory, and it was a study on one guy with no control group where the researcher asked him, okay, well, after 8 weeks, do you lose your keys less often? And he said, yes. you would laugh them out of the room. But if you are the N of one, it is your experience taking ginkgo biloba. It's your experience that, you don't lose your car keys as much. You will be persuaded by that because our own experience has power over us in a way that spreadsheets don't. And, we all like to sort of poo-poo this because, we believe in science. But think about it. I mean, human beings evolved in an absence of spreadsheets. I mean, since we crawled out of the primordial ooze, we haven't had any reason to get good at parsing data. We didn't even have the idea of control groups until, 1750 or whenever it was that James Lind did that experiment with sailors. And yet we expect that we can incorporate data into a decision-making apparatus that has been optimized for the personal, the tribal, the familial, the oral, seamlessly. And obviously we can't do that. We suck at it, all of us humans. And because we do have this decision-making apparatus that is primed for our own experience. And so that, of course, is very, very powerful to us. I mean, that's how we evolved to the top of the food chain in planetary dominance, is by having this decision-making apparatus. And so, of course, it's gone pretty rough when we've tried to incorporate the results of controlled trials.
Well, and the fact that we are hardwired to do that and to try to connect those dots and make that connection with the cause and effect in our brains. And just as I'm listening to you talk and I'm experiencing what you're saying, I feel like maybe this is why your journalism is so powerful to me, because I feel like there's a huge disconnect between what registered dietitians, nutritionists do with patients one-on-one or in group classes, where we listen to the patient or the client. We take their own personal experience very, very seriously, and we try to help them figure out, based on what their suggested options are. Here are some options for you, whether it's for diabetes or weight management or heart health or fitness. Here are some suggestions based on your lifestyle and your priorities and what you feel works for you and doesn't work for you. And I feel like all of that is completely just like apples and oranges compared to nutrition communications to the masses, because you can't have that personal one-on-one listening to each individual person's unique needs and thoughts and feelings and lifestyles. And I feel like that's where things get lost in the translation sometimes. And of course, there's, nutrition research and control groups and that sort of thing that loses that personal Walther Effect, if you will. So that's what's hard for me as a dietitian. It makes perfect sense when I'm working with somebody one-on-one. But then when we try to translate that to the masses, that's where I feel like we end up with taglines that are oversimplified and policies that sort of miss the mark because they're either watered down or oversimplified or so generic that they're meaningless.
Well, my take on this is that I actually think we know very, very little about the connection between diet and health outcomes. We know specific things about how to treat disease, certainly deficiency diseases, and we have ways to tackle things like hypertension. But for the most part, eating to reduce your risk of cancer or heart disease or, catching a virus is something that is basically not possible beyond the most broad brush strokes. So eat a variety of whole foods in quantities consistent with the weight you want to be, I think is about as good as it gets. I think that there are a lot of problems with nutrition advice. One of them is, of course, that people are different. But the other is, I think that the entire nutrition world has to sort of take some responsibility for the conflicting and complex and sometimes downright wrong advice that has come out of the public health community that in some ways is responsible for, I think, people's reluctance to listen to what people have to say now.
Yeah, and I think it's hard. I mean, you touched on two things that I'd love to touch on with you is like the limitations inherent in nutrition research and also the evolution of research and the nature of science, it does seem flip-floppy and it is contradictory. And then this study says that and that study says that. I think that in general, there's a lot of challenges and limitations. And I don't think those are easy to translate to the public in a way that resonates or that's reassuring.
It's not reassuring. That's why it's hard to convey in a way that is reassuring, because it's actually kind of scary that we don't have the tools to figure these things out.
Yeah. Well, what I like to explain sometimes is, like with the limitations, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is it's hard, it's difficult, and oftentimes unethical to randomize control, put people in a treatment group and a control group, and then the length of time that it would require. And by the time you get involved, like it's not even something that would be realistically achievable, if you weren't doing a study and controlling all those factors.
And then you can't kill them and autopsy their livers.
Exactly.
And, there's all kinds of things. And the problem here, I think, is that for those reasons that you cite, and I think you're exactly right, and for other reasons that we haven't gotten to yet, I think the limitations in nutrition research are basically inherent.
Right.
So it's not like we're getting better at this and so we're zeroing in on the truth.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we keep running the same correlations against these giant cohorts of observational data and getting results that are all over the map. And then the last ridiculous study that made headlines was that, you should filter your coffee. And it's not only does it not help people, I think it has hurt in a big way, because it has left people with the idea that, nutrition science can't get its act together, which in some ways it's true. And they can't agree on what's helpful and what isn't, which in some ways is true. And so what gets lost in the shuffle is that we've known for forever, basically, what the foundation of a healthful diet is. And that's, a wide variety of whole foods and quantities consistent with the way you want to be.
Yeah.
I've said it a million times.
Right. And what gets lost in the shuffle there is that person. And as you're talking, I mean, this is something I say all the time, that the person just feels like, well, why bother even paying attention to this, and throws their hands up and says, whatever. Exactly. Yeah. Well, and then I'll just touch on this briefly and we can move on. But there's also this aspect of nutrition research, and I'm going to be interviewing somebody on NHANES soon, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Surveys, about the whole 24-hour recall or food records. That is like, let's build a house on a quicksand, because I know that you criticize that as well. And
don't get me started.
I know, it's what people say versus what people do versus what they're reporting and versus what the purchasing data shows. And I mean, that's why I find consumer insights and behaviors really interesting. I find that more interesting than, some of the, pontification or some of the actual research, because I'm curious about what people are thinking and why they're doing certain things. But
except that a lot of times they don't really tell you.
Right.
So research where you ask people what they do also never matches what people actually do.
Right.
Although it can give you some insight into, what they're thinking and what the aspirational behavior is.
Or even could they remember?
Right. And, one thing on FFQs, people who have a lot of faith in NHANES data, I send them a link to fill out the food frequency questionnaire that people have to fill out. And it's nuts. You can't remember how many servings of cabbage you've had in a year.
No.
And some of the questions are even harder than that. And, Walter Willett says with some justification that what you can do is look at the people who say eat very few eggs versus the people who eat a whole lot of eggs. And that's absolutely true. But the people who are outliers in one way may be outliers in other ways too. And I think it's not realistic to expect such a flawed database, and confounded also, of course, to tease out any connections between food and health outcomes that aren't glaringly obvious. And we've already gotten the glaringly obvious ones, I think.
Very true. So I know, speaking of that, I know you're a big fan of lentils, as am I.
I'm a big fan of lentils.
Is it your favorite food? I mean, is that the top of your list?
No, I like all kinds of food. I like everything. And I like lentils partly because I think they're cheap, they're versatile. If everybody ate more of them, we could use them as a crop to rotate in with some of the more commonly grown crops like corn and soy. And I just think they're storable. I just think lentils have everything going for them as far as food. And all legumes do, chickpeas and also whole grains, rye and wheat. So yeah, no, I'm a total big lentil fan.
So I was just curious if you have a favorite way you like to use lentils in a dish.
Well, first of all, legumes and whole grains also are the motto in our house is everything's better with preserved pork products. So we tend to incorporate a little bit of bacon or a little bit of sausage into things that we make that are grain and legume heavy. And I make a lentil soup with a pork sausage that we're pretty fond of in this house, a whole bunch of carrots. And it's a house favorite.
Okay. Well, is that a recipe you might be willing to share with us?
Oh, no, just wing it.
Okay. You're that kind of cook. Now I'm really jealous. Thank you. Made me feel so bad. Okay. Well, I know there are people listening who could just take that and kind of go with it.
It's hard to do it badly, especially if you have lots of carrots and crushed tomatoes and a little bit of sausage. It's just not going to be bad.
Perfect taste combination. Excellent. Well, I saw a tweet from you, I think it was back in March, where you kind of said, okay, coronavirus, COVID-19, what do I write about with food and nutrition now with this going on? And it resonated with me because I was kind of going through the stages of grief, anger, denial, bargaining, whatever, like almost on an hourly basis, thinking, do I want to do a podcast related to this? I don't want to seem opportunistic. I also, where everybody was at in their minds was stocking their pantry, which I think is really important. It's just not my thing. But then when I started seeing some of this really horrible information of, the YouTube video that went viral with that supposed physician putting a bag full of oranges into a sink full of suds, I was like, okay, that's it. I have to do something related to coronavirus and food safety because all my buttons are pushed right now. So I tweeted back to you that maybe you could address some of the food safety questions and misinformation out there. So I was curious if you have decided, are you going to write anything related to COVID-19?
Probably not related to food safety because food safety is not my area. Virology is not my area. And one of the things that I feel lucky that I've been able to write for many, many years on just this small slice of life on nutrition and agriculture. And I really admire journalists who actually venture farther afield from their areas of expertise because I think it shows an inquisitive mind and a willingness to tackle something new. But I live in fear of getting things wrong. And I have a lot of opinions about the area that I've spent a long, long time trying to understand. I don't have opinions about things I understand less well. And the last thing I want to do is go out there and try and understand what kills a virus and what doesn't, when it seems the people who are studying this virus aren't quite sure what kills a virus and what doesn't. And, I think we have enough people going outside their areas of expertise and setting themselves as advice givers on this thing. The last thing you need is me doing it.
Wow, excellent. Every time you speak, I'm like, that's again why I like you, because I have that curiosity, but this huge fear of saying something wrong.
Yeah.
But you mentioned agriculture. Have you thought about talking with anyone in the agricultural community about, because I know you talk about food supply chain issues, anything, and I don't want to tip your hand about anything that you're writing on.
No, I'm doing a little less about agriculture, and I've sort of pivoted a little bit away from it, and I'm writing more about human nutrition and obesity, which are the sort of the things that brought me into food in the first place. And I actually think that what's relevant as far as my work with regard to our current situation is that, all right, I've said for a long time that the reason we have the American diet is crappy and, 3/4 of American adults are overweight, is that we've created a monster of a food system that is non-navigable by people because there's, cheap, delicious, convenient food that is specifically engineered to be irresistible to you. everywhere you turn. And now all of a sudden, okay, we've blown that food system to smithereens, and it gives us a terrific opportunity to rebuild it in a different way. So, I think that people are taking more control of their own food system at home. Last month, I actually wrote about gardening.
Got a lot of traction on that.
I know. I was shocked.
Yeah.
I have to tell you, because I was afraid it was going to be a dud. And the people were like, oh, yeah, this is great.
Wow.
And I was so surprised. And I spent 10 years, my husband and I, really trying every kind of DIY food you can think of. And I actually know something about that, and I have some experience with it. And if I can help people through this using some of that, then, well, that's where I'm going to go. Because basically, if you're a journalist, and I'm sure if you're a dietitian, what you really want to be is of use to people. I want the things that I have learned over these years to translate into something that somebody finds helpful. So that's kind of where I'm focused right now.
Absolutely. Amen. Well, that's what I was going to ask you, is if you think this pandemic will provide the opportunity or lead to more meaningful conversations about food, instead of worrying about pesticides and paleo diets, and thinking more about food insecurity and understanding our food system better and getting around that table with your friends or family every day.
I don't know. I don't think any of us knows. I mean, we're just sort of beginning to wrap our minds around the fact that this is a very big change, and it's going to continue to be a very big change, I think, in some ways, although hopefully not in others. And to come to grips with the changes that are happening all around us, and then try and step up and steer those changes in ways that are constructive, is a big ask. People are stressed. People are worried. People are broke. And, are we really thinking about nutrition and food systems and obesity? And the answer for a lot of people is hell no. We're worried about whether we're going to get rent relief. We're worried about what kind of job you're going to get on the other end of this. But I think the answer for some people is yes, because I know for me, when a lot of things are uncertain, what helps me is taking control over the things I can control. And that helps me face the things that I can't control with a sense of agency and positivity. And I know I'm not the only one who feels that way. And hopefully we can find the will and the wherewithal collectively to make some good changes that come out of this.
Beautifully said. Tamar, thank you so much for talking with me today, and for all the, I would say, hard work and important work that you do to foster productive conversations about food.
Thank you for your kind words. I really do appreciate them. And thank you for having me on the podcast.
My pleasure. And for everybody listening, as always, enjoy your food with health in mind. Till next time.
For more information, visit soundbitesrd.com. Music by Dave Burke, produced by Jag in Detroit Podcasts.